You know, you and I have talked over the years that we've known one another about our families. And you know, from my past history, my experience with my mother in long term nursing care due to her brain cancer and the subsequent radiation treatments that she had due to that brain cancer and our inability to take care of her. And so I became intimately familiar with the next subject matter. I am by no means an expert, and we thought it important to bring in an expert because I think this is a subject more and more on the minds of the listening audience as as family members live longer lives as we extend a life with medical science. There also comes pitfalls and traps and dangers associated with that.
I think what you and I experienced, and with your mom and with my mom too, she had a horrible fall a few years back. I don't think we were working together at the time, and had to go from the hospital into a rehab/assisted living facility temporarily. And I can remember my dad and I sitting on the side of the road thinking we are expected to be experts and put this woman we adore in the right place that's safe. And we pulled over on the side of the road. We both had tears streaming down our faces because we had to be experts in a short amount of time. And you feel like you're out there all by yourself. So on this subject of taking our loved ones, putting them in these different facilities for the medical help they need, and when you get there, the papers you sign, and all these different scenarios you play out in your mind. Perry Shuttlesworth is an attorney here in Birmingham, and you really are an expert on this, talking about any loved one, but particularly elder care. We hear of these horror stories all the time across the United States. Families are put in this position like Matt was and I was, where we are trying to do what's best for our loved one. And we feel like oftentimes we don't have choices. You sign a bunch of paperwork and then you have them there. Perry, we wanted to bring you in because you had information that, quite frankly, I didn't know a lot about.
Sure.
First and foremost, welcome.
Yes, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. Folks are, most of us either have or will be in that position where we've got to get some extra help for our loved ones. And most of us, when that happens, haven't been down that road before. So you don't really know what to do. And it's confusing and it's frightening because, time is typically of the essence when you reach that point. And there aren't that many, there are resources, but they're limited. There's a rating system where you can actually go on the Department of Health and Human Services and check out nursing homes ratings and so forth. But at the end of the day, there's a leap of faith. You do the best you can, and whether it's for rehab or whether it's for long-term care, and unfortunately, it's kind of a just figured out as you go situation. Just because of the way the lay of the land for the nursing home world in our country and our state.
I mean, what is your primary role? Should we, if we are considering moving forward, should we contact you first? I mean, or do you come in later if there is a suggestion of possibly a breach of the standard of care or those sorts of things?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, we get calls, from folks in all different stages of it. Now, for myself, I'm more of a nursing home litigator, and I handle cases where somebody's been neglected or abused.
Right.
But I work with a lot of elder lawyers who are more involved in these early on, admission issues, because you've got asset issues, you've got Medicaid eligibility issues. How are you going to pay for it? Is it a private pay facility? Do they accept Medicare and Medicaid? And what do you need to do to be eligible? So people call me about that. I usually refer those to what's called an elder lawyer for those kind of things. My particular area really is more of being a trial lawyer, being a litigator. I've done it on the defense side and the plaintiff side in this industry, and so but that's typically where I come in.
I can't imagine some of the cases you've handled, and to the people we care about most in the most vulnerable state, I cannot imagine the families when they call you and you read over these cases, what you see, what you deal with.
Yeah, it's tragic and sad. I can look at a nursing home chart and see pretty much in hindsight where everything went wrong. And so it's part of what I've been trying to figure out over the years as a way to impart the knowledge that I have to some of these families so that they can play a more active role in advocating for their loved ones so that maybe these outcomes can be avoided. Because there is a limited universe of injuries that we see that relate to neglect. Dehydration, just simply not giving enough water, is very common. Can lead to renal failure, swelling of the brain from elevated sodium, and death. Pressure sores, which are almost always avoidable no matter what anyone tells you from a nursing home, they really are with good care. Choking and aspiration, not getting the proper amount of help that you need to eat and drink. Falls are pretty typical. So, those are the things that we see, and there are things that folks, the family members can do to help advocate to try and avoid these outcomes, but they need more knowledge than they have currently.
I want to look at it a little bit from 50,000 feet, and we can kind of boil it down. I mean, more often than not, what are the causal factors? I'm sure that they are many and varied. I'm certain that you can identify just a bad facility, quote unquote, one that's simply not giving the proper amount of treatment. Or maybe it's a matter of a facility getting overwhelmed and not being able to keep up with the amount of patients that they have. What are you seeing? Okay,
so you hit one nail on the head for sure, which is staffing. Okay, so that's probably the highest line item expense for a nursing home as far as their financial operations expenses. And so they keep staffing low, and too low in my opinion most of the time. But really, if you had to say the common denominator, what are the things that happen, whether or not it's this injury or that injury? What happens that causes these outcomes? And here's what it is, I think, almost always. So you've got someone in a nursing home, you have your mom, she's rocking along, she's doing fine, and then all of a sudden she has some change in her condition. And it could be short term, it could be a stomach bug, she's throwing up a lot, losing fluids. Just like a child, you have to make sure she gets more fluids. So, or it could be that someone's had somewhat of a decline in their mental status and they're having a harder time taking in food and water. From a functional standpoint, they need more help, or they're less steady on their feet. So you've got somewhat of a change in their condition, and under the regulations, the nursing home has to be very observant and monitor for that. And when there's a change in condition, there needs to be a corresponding change in the care plan and treatment and level of assistance. But, if you don't have enough people to be looking for that and the system is not, carefully laid out the way it's supposed to be, then you've got residents who have they have higher needs that aren't being met with higher care. That's kind of the bottom line.
Part of the problem that you brought to our attention is a word, arbitration.
Yes.
What is that exactly, and what do we need to be aware of? Because some of the outcomes of these cases are very upsetting, and arbitration may be the reason for that.
Yeah.
People aren't held accountable in some cases.
So I'll say this, first of all, we handle a lot of arbitration cases.
What is that?
Arbitration is a substitute for a jury trial. So typically, if you're in litigation in court, you're in front of a judge and a jury. If you go try the case, if there are errors committed by the judge or the jury, then you have the right of appeal. And the case gets decided by a jury of your peers. It's constitutional. But if you go into a nursing home, when you sign the admission agreement, there's almost always part of that admission agreement is an arbitration agreement that you end up signing because you're in there and you're not thinking about what may happen down the road, and they let your mom become dehydrated and die. And they don't tell you that if you sign this, this is going to adversely affect your rights. If there is a problem, you're not going to be able to exercise your constitutional right to a jury trial. The case will be heard by one person who will serve as judge and jury. There is no appeal. Their order is final, and they can do whatever they want, and you have to live by it. And the nursing homes are going to likely pay for it, so, who do you think they're going to favor? So the bottom line is it's really not a fair situation. It's not a level playing field, and people get led into it, and it's really kind of a travesty.
And do people have to? I mean, I would think from the nursing home perspective, a lot of these nursing homes who would want you to sign an agreement of this sort would say, well, you have to if you want to bring mom or dad here.
Yeah. Well, they often do, and there are some arbitration agreements that say this is voluntary. Most of them, they don't have that language, but the person, the admissions director, is telling you have to do it. And the truth is, though, I have a lot of clients who refuse to do it, and when they refuse, they still get their loved one admitted, number one, because they're trying to fill the beds, and it's the way that they make money, and they need people in beds.
Right.
There's also an argument that if they require you and force you to, it's what we call a contract of adhesion, because it's kind of complicated to explain exactly what that is, but they force you into it. There is an argument that for that reason, if they force it upon you, that it's not enforceable. By and large, though, from a practical standpoint, if you refuse to do it, I've never seen a nursing home kick you out onto the street with your loved one and say, we won't take you because of that, actually.
That's key. Because they're going to say something like, they'll put a piece of paper in front of you and say, this just says
arbitration agreement.
That
just sign
we'll,
this
if
thing.
something we disagree, we'll see someone and
they'll mediate
mediate. Fine. Okay, and you sign it because you're just like, all right, we got to. So you're right. If I say I'm not signing this, I'm not comfortable, I need to work on this or think about it. Just don't put your signature on it. And chances are they'll say, okay, well, you'll just bring this back to us. Okay, we got that.
Yeah, and I think that's typically right. The problem is they don't tell you anything that along the lines of what I just said about it, which is the truth. What they tell you is this is a more efficient, time-consuming, and better process. None of that is true, actually. We spend just as much money and time, sometimes more money and time. We have the same requirements to spend a fortune on experts and so forth and so on. So the idea, the selling points are simply not accurate. But if you're there trying to get your loved one into a nursing home and you're not knowledgeable about it, you have no reason not to believe them.
I mean, you are a plaintiff's attorney.
I am.
So would an argument be made that from your perspective, it's more difficult because the goalpost kind of shift in favor of the defendant, in this case, the nursing home?
Well, there's no question about it.
Yeah.
So like I said before,
you'd prefer a court of law with
absolutely,
a judge
100% of the time.
I think I would too. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if mom doesn't make it out and there's some egregious, problems with the care, I would want the ability to appeal if a mediator says no, that everything was handled right.
Well, and first of all, you want the case to be heard by a jury of your peers, which are people like me and you that are working in our area, in our county. These are regular folks, and they're not biased one way or the other going into it. In an arbitration, you've got somebody typically being paid by the nursing home industry, and there's an immediate bias, and there is no review. They can do what they want. Sure.
Perry Shuttlesworth, our guest. We'll take a quick time out. I want to ask Perry on the other side about warning signs, if you have a loved one within a facility, and about maybe rules of the road or tips.
Documentation, how do you...
Well, I'm thinking about if you're thinking of putting a loved one in a facility, if there are any tips that he can share with us regarding how to look for the best types of facilities in our area. Talking with Perry Shuttlesworth, who is a local attorney here in Birmingham, specializing in long-term elder care, acting as an advocate for individuals who perhaps have seen some warning signs of neglect or abuse, or even further down the road with regard to the legal system in respect to those things. And I wanted to ask, you want to try to catch these things on the front end, Perry. Obviously, you don't want to. God forbid I have to call you, although I'm certain you're great at what you do, because of a death in the family or because of a discovery of long-term abuse. So are there rules of the road or tips or warning flags that you can point to?
There are, and I'm not plugging my firm, but I've drafted an ebook that helps people kind of know what to look for, that they should be concerned about and ask questions. What you see, what you hear, what you smell, what you observe. If you go in and you see there's a change or an altered mental status, somebody's more confused. If there is less steadiness on their feet, if someone has nausea and vomiting, if someone is lethargic and doesn't want to get out of bed, You'll go ask a nurse, and it's like, well, what is wrong with Mama today? And typically the response, from my experience, is they're just having one of those days. That may be true, but it may not be. And so there are things that you can ask for that you are entitled to. If you're the sponsor or the family member, you're entitled to see the care plan. You're entitled to see the nurse's notes. You're entitled to demand that some lab work get done so that to determine if they're dehydrated. You're entitled to see the body audits. Do they have a pressure sore that started that you haven't been informed of, for example? So you're entitled to, and I would encourage any family to go and ask question after question and demand some records. Ask to see some of the assessments that are being done. Ask, and if you have real concerns, I've had, a lot of times you can ask for them to be sent out to an emergency room to be seen, and sometimes the nursing homes will agree to do that, sometimes they won't. And if you really believe that that's what needs to happen and they're not doing it, do it yourself. You can call and have an ambulance come yourself, but don't just take the standard she's having one of those days as an absolute truth. You're entitled to get more information.
Talked about an ebook. Where do folks find that? Because that's something I think we all need to look over, because we will be there at some point.
It's just on my website. It's something that we drafted that's just intended to help people know how to advocate for their loved ones, so that maybe we don't even need to be hired one day, honestly.
And real quick, only about a minute left, but any tips that you have, basic tips about when looking for a facility, perhaps in advance of an elderly
Sure.
person?
Well, there's a rating system. You can go to the Department of Health and Human Services and see how many stars a facility has. You're entitled to see online. You can find what we call annual surveys, which are basically investigations that are done on an annual basis of all nursing homes. You can see what their survey results were, and you can read for yourself some of the problems they have and some of the instances that cause the surveyors or the investigators some concern. You can do those things yourself.
The website for the ebook?
It's shuttlesworthlaw.com. www.shuttlesworthlaw.com.
Perry Shuttlesworth, great conversation. Thank you for coming in.